just want to welcome you all here tonight, and thank you very, very much for coming out on this cold, wintry night on a Saturday on top of it. I just want to say a few words before I introduce our speakers. It's following on the well-attended GMM that we had Ford More Years a few weeks ago here in this room, and not to mention the really well-attended event at Steel Hall last Thursday, where there was a great Q&A between Sam Gindin and a very inspirational American union organizer by the name of, I hope I'm going to pronounce her name right, Jane McLevy. It was extremely well attended, and I'm sure some of you here tonight were at that event. It was quite exceptional. The Coffee House tonight is the continuation of a series begun last fall, and will continue into the spring at least. The series is focused on intersectionality of our various oppressions. That very kind of awkward phrase means that the ways that patriarchy, racism, bourgeois nationalism, gender issues, and class are all interrelated and are related to the various oppressions that we experience in late capitalist society. A relatively new challenge, which we haven't particularly engaged with, but we will in the future, is the increasingly devastating climate change issue that we were just beginning to grapple with. Our best hope is that these presentations will provide us with the tools, with the analysis, that we can integrate into our anti-capitalist organizing work. In doing so, the GTWA is continuing its commitment to provide a safe, open political space where people from various positions can come together to exchange their ideas and practices, and hopefully eventually learn to work together to advance our similar anti-capitalist agenda. I just want to end the introduction by commenting on one issue that I think is of increasing concern to us, and that's the rise of the right. The rise of the right in this country, the rise of the right particularly in Europe. It doesn't take us much to know about the politics in Europe to know that there are active, elected fascist parties in Greece, in France, and of course Ukraine, as we noticed. That's an extremely worrying development, and we know what has happened regarding that in the past. And of course, over on this side of the water, there's the US Tea Party, and not to mention Ford and Ford Nation, that has intimations of that as well. And of course, my sense is that there is that this reality should be an increasing motivator in our work, and to the very serious urgency of getting our shit together on the left in terms of how we're developing our work. We really don't want to repeat the experience of the 20s and 30s in the last century, which was the greatest defeat of the working class and socialism in the Western world. So many of the issues that we're dealing with these in the coffee houses, relate to this, and building our strength in order to convince more and more people that there needs to be a serious positive change. Thank you for that. So I'm going to introduce our speakers one at a time before they make their presentations. It's going to begin with Steve, and if Ajamo shows up shortly, it'll be number 2. And then we'll finish with Winnie. So to begin with Steve. Steve is an associate professor and the chair of the Department of Geology at York University and a member of the Workers' Assembly. His research interests are related to the labor union renewal, union organizing activity in the service industries, and labor market adjustment in the hospitality sector. He's also involved in projects studying the impact of populism on organized labor and of the impact of climate change on tourist-related employment and work. Steve will talk about the changing class composition of Toronto and the challenges it poses and a few ways that we may go ahead with that. He will also be putting this in the context of Ford populism and making some links to our ongoing Coffee House series. Okay, thank you for that. Steve?
Thank you, John. Thank you, John, and thanks for organizing this evening. Lets me tie together several issues I've been thinking about for a long time. I'm sorry, this is for the recording, I think. And I've been doing work with labor movement since the 1990s. A lot of my work is with hotel workers in Toronto, racialized and migrant labor force, highly segmented, facing multiple oppressions, as is the title of this session. That's where I first met Winnie. That was a long time ago. So long ago I was still using shampoo. So this has been a long-term project. The title of my remarks tonight, I called it Rob Ford and McDonald's. And I'll maybe tie those themes in a little bit later. And for the left, and for left speaking broadly, all the way from what we once called Social Democratic NDP to socialist and anarchist, the election of Rob Ford was, I think, a psychological trauma for many, at least in the first instance. Even mild progressives such as Ed Keenan in his book called the election apocalyptic. And it really did challenge elites and their thinking about how they understood Toronto as a cosmopolitan city. Now, of course, the immediate reaction to that was the divided city discourse, and this was also called the myth of the angry immigrant. Stefan Kipfer, the last time we met, in his talk, defined this quite well. And the idea that the suburbs and the inner suburbs and downtown core are deeply divided. And this was a myth, and with a little bit of research, mostly related to what's called ecological analysis, because really good electoral research is difficult because you need very large surveys. It really problematized this divide, but it's still, that's the way most of Toronto reads the situation. And the cover of Toronto Life magazine this month with the map of divided Toronto, if you ever looked at it, and sees that. But it was challenged by a number of researchers and commentators, many we know, Herman Rosenfeld, Todd Gordon, Paris Saberi, and Kipfer, and a few others, Zach Taylor to a lesser extent. And this was really important because we had to confront what was an immediately racist discourse about the angry migrant. The migrants are homophobic, the migrants are fed up, they're isolated, they drive cars, and all this other nonsense. And we had to challenge this, and it's really important to challenge such a myth because if you let that go to its full extent, any kind of the left will eventually give up and abandon the racialized working class, and that's a space for political organization and will put us even farther back than we already are. Now, there's a danger to going too far with a corrective to challenging that myth, because what you do is you immediately confront what's called, I call the noble migrant. The idea that the migrant, racialized worker is already internally radicalized, they're ready to be marching the streets, they were just misguided and just need a little bit of leadership and organization, and they will eventually lead us to a left alternative. And that's not true either. It's actually the same flip side as the same racist coin. So luckily, progressives with a little bit of careful thinking started to delve deeper into what may have caused what is probably the genuine voting pattern, which is Ford had quite a diverse base of support among racialized migrant workers, and of course white workers as well, and even elites in the financial sector. But I think we have to go further beyond by looking at that pattern, other than thinking that, well, we just disrespected the car, and car ownership is really the defining feature of what caused the voting disjuncture. I think we have to look really closely at what Ford represents, both culturally and in policy-wise. And the policy-wise stuff has been done, but I'm going to go a little bit deeper with what I call working class aesthetic that I think he puts out there. Now, how do we understand this thing? I think you have to go back one step further and look at changing class composition in Toronto. And to do that, and I mean that in three senses of the word: social class composition between elites and working class, technical composition of working class, what people are doing in their jobs within the working class and how they're segmented in labor markets and how they're excluded and how those divisions are recreated. And then the disjunctures that flow from that in our political composition of the working class and how we're actually defeated and unable at this time to launch any real alternative. Now, with the social composition of the working class, I think there's elites versus workers. But I'm going to say a couple things that might be provocative tonight. I don't believe that there is a division among elites in Toronto. I think they don't always get their first choice, but just because Rob Ford was Plan B doesn't mean he wasn't in the plan. Ford, Miller, and I'll even go farther, Olivia Chow, is not going to be a big difference in changing class relations in Toronto. That the elites may not get their first choice, but they can work with Plan B and they can work with Plan C. That's, I think, something that my position on this. And the Plan B in this case, which is Ford, right-wing populism, as John mentioned, is universal almost in advanced capitalist economies and in the global south as well. Right-wing populism is on an ascendancy, and we just have one form of it in Toronto. And we see this in Ukraine and across the world. It comes to the technical division of what plays into this right-wing populism, however, we have to look at segmented labor markets and the changes that have happened in the last 30 years in Toronto. And I'll just run through this quickly. First, decline of manufacturing, and manufacturing in Toronto is a source of employment for migrant workers. So when manufacturing is in decline, that creates job pressures and unemployment. Second, the rise of private sector services, which have absorbed migrant workers and at lower wage rates. Third is the decline of the public service, currently in the midst of austerity. Now, that's a double threat, because one, it makes declines in overall employment opportunities, but also the public service is a center of space of exclusion of migrant workers. Yes, there are migrant racialized workers in the public service, but they tend to be in the lower paying jobs, and in some professions, they're almost invisible. They're excluded for the Canadian born. So when you're talking about right-wing populism attacking public services, it's not surprising that migrant workers who are excluded from those services aren't really willing to step up and defend them. I think that's important. And that gets to the public-private sector divide. And just if you don't believe me, because I do a lot of work with statistics, private sector differential and public sector differential wages, $23 an hour average in Toronto for private sector, $30 for public. 13.4% unionization rates in private sector, 67% in public sector. 48% of workers in Toronto, about half, are migrant. Other half, of course, Canadian born, but only about 30% in public administration are migrant workers. Real exclusion. The exception is healthcare, but of course, healthcare employs a lot of migrant workers in those low-wage, high labor-intensive jobs. Then we get into the political composition, and we have a couple of things to mention here. First is that the working class institutions have become feminized. Now, that's not a problem. The problem is that unions now are mostly dominant. In 2006 in Canada, there were more women union members than men for the first time in history. The problem isn't with the feminization of the labor movement. The problem is that it's an incomplete project. It hasn't been carried forward to where it needs to go. So we have women members in unions because of the public sector employment, but we don't have women members in the leadership positions. We don't have women, and a campaign that says an attack on unions is an attack on women. And further than that, we haven't carried forward through a true feminization of the labor movement, which is an anti-racist feminization, which allows for much more diversity in leadership and for different participatory structures to change unions, and in some cases, maybe dismiss unions and invent a completely different type of working class representation, living wage movements, working centers. That's just hasn't carried through yet. It's incomplete. And the second point of the political composition of the working classes, we have a divided and fragmented left, and it's small, and it's useless. It just doesn't work. The NDP has gone to the center. There is no alternative that's any meaningful in existence today. That's just a fact. If anyone wants to dispute me, willing to have that debate. And that leads us to Ford. All these conditions come together and lead us to Ford. And we've talked about Ford and its policies, how they with subways versus cars that appeal to the suburbs. But there's something about Ford that's also, I think, a broader appeal to working people, and that is he's embodied. And what do I mean by that? I don't want to sound too much like an academic. I'm going back to the work of Pierre Bourdieu, and is talking about a working class aesthetic, which is an aesthetic appeal based in materiality, not in the abstract. On music, food. Ford eats. He eats a lot. He eats fast food. Ford likes sports. Ford likes cars. Ford does drugs. And Ford has problems with police. And he represents all this in the most recent, I guess I would say, incident he had at State Queen in the inner suburbs, when he did his rant against Blair and called Blair a cocksucker. And then the media went around and tried to find people of color to speak against Ford, and they're all saying, it's his personal life. It's just who he is. He does some okay things. Well, a deeper thing is with targeted policing in the inner suburbs, a lot of people of color think that Blair's a cocksucker too. And that's the reality of the relationship here, is that targeted policing, even though Ronaldo Walcott has gone to his greatest efforts ever to try to demystify this and say this is a white privilege. If Ford was a person of color, he'd be in jail. Okay? But there's a relationship here with the policing and the discipline of the body. So, how do we get out of this? How do we apply these changes and this rise of populism and this appeal with how we reflect on our own organizations and what kind of campaigns and things we can do? Well, I've got a couple of things here that I think we can work on, and I do think it's not always negative. I think there's some good starting points. One is we have to be honest about public and private service campaigns, especially when we try to talk about fighting with the public, save the public service from austerity. We have to ask questions right at the front. Is the service that we want to fight for worthy of protecting? Is it something that people want? Is fighting for a social service that does nothing but discipline working people worth it? Do we need it? That's a fundamental question the left doesn't ask. We often start from the point, it's a public service, we need it, because it's not private. Second, we have to ask, who in the public service is providing those services? Are those jobs equitably distributed? Are women, are racialized minorities, are Indigenous people included in the services that they're dependent on? Are they producing them? And in many cases, they're not. And the third point is we have to reinvent the service, if it is worthy, into a delivery that isn't racist and isn't homophobic and is a decolonized service. And we have to challenge things. So if you're going to fight for teachers against a provincial government, maybe we have to also fight for a more equitable education system, where people are going to stay on the sidelines. They're not going to fight for a public service that A, doesn't employ members from their community, and B, does nothing but discipline their bodies. And that's one of the things I think we have to think seriously about. Second, we have to really think about the culture of the working class itself. And really think about what do we do to celebrate the working class and its diversity and its racialized migrant members, and also what are we doing that maybe reinforces a sense of elitism that the downtown elites are practicing that limit appeals to the inner and outer suburbs. For example, what probably the working class are going to find them, like it or not, is in Bollywood, romantic comedies, Vin Diesel action films. We're not going to be making connections with the working class in documentary film festivals that 35 people attend. These are critical questions we have to look at our own practices. And I think that's important. We also have to look at the way, I think, going forward and question ourselves on what spaces we think are worthy of organizing and our working class spaces. And here I think I'm really excited by some of the fast food campaigns in the US. Now they're problematic. They're orchestrated largely by the SEIU, and they haven't been executed in a democratic manner. And that critique is all over the labor press if you read it. But one thing we have to start thinking of is that McDonald's, as this symbolic corporate capitalist signifier, that might be one reading. But McDonald's is also a space of community. It's a space where Korean old people in New York were kicked out of because they were drinking their coffee for too long. But it was the only community space they had. It's a place that allows play space for children. In some communities, it's the only space for children. So we have to rethink of McDonald's as a community space, and that the work done there is actually worthy of working and being organized, and that there's so much surplus value generated by fast food that they can pay workers more. And once we organize those spaces and realize that they are working class spaces, then we can fight to get their menus changed so the food doesn't make you sick. And lastly, we have to go back to my final point. We have to really be conscious of this sort of suburban-urban divide. Yes, it's been overplayed in the progressive media, but it doesn't mean it's not entirely unreal. And we have to start building alliances and going back to all spaces in going from all scales, from the urban to the suburban to the regional, the countryside to the global. And this goes back to Fanon, and Fanon, when he was writing about the differences between the city and the countryside, said, you urban industrial organizers, you ignore the countryside at your peril. And we have to think about the suburbs and the countryside in the same way going back 60 years. And there are some signs that we're doing this. The Line 9 campaign, the anti-tar sands campaign. They're building links with inner city movements, suburban communities that are having these pipelines pumped through them, and with indigenous communities that are having their land stolen and raped and destroyed in the whole process. And only by building those kind of movements, because you need all three groups, will we be able to move forward and actually fight what are multiple oppressions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.